Hello and welcome back to the Training Tom podcast, the place where I share the lessons I've learned, the challenges I'm currently facing, and the questions I have for my future self. And in today's episode, we're touching on perfectionism. So let's get to it. I'm in a slightly different setting for today's episode, and I think it's throwing me a little bit, but that also links quite nicely into what today's focus is going to be on. This isn't my usual setup, but maybe that's just because I'm trying to focus on the setup being perfect for me. So at this moment in time, I am in Birmingham for work. So I'm staying in a hotel room, and it's not my usual setup. So I've still got my camera, my microphone, but it just doesn't feel familiar and doesn't look familiar. So it feels strange recording in this way. Like even hearing my voice kind of echo around the room, it's throwing me ever so slightly because it's just a different environment to what I'm used to. But as I mentioned, that is kind of linked into what this episode is about, perfectionism. And in particular, why am I trying to be perfect? Not all of the time, but in particular at this moment in time, why do I feel like I'm trying to be perfect? And I think it's important to go back to how I have lived my life up until this point. And for a lot of my life, I have been a massive perfectionist in the things that I do, in the way that I present myself, in just lots of different facets, lots of different areas of my life. If I look back to my teenage years, my school, my exercise, like playing in sport, and just basically everything that I did, especially through my teenage years and through university, I wanted to be perfect at. And naturally, that meant that I wanted to be the best at those things as well. And that's not a very healthy place to be, as you can imagine, because I feel like for a lot of those instances, wanting to be perfect at everything that I did held me back held me back a lot of the time, because you're never going to be perfect, and B, by wanting to be perfect, it meant that a lot of the time I didn't take action. And by not taking action, you can't therefore become perfect at it. It's a very all or nothing mindset that I find myself in when I'm in this perfectionist space, is that I'm either going to do something perfectly or I'm not going to do it at all. And that's a really challenging place to be, because a lot of the time you want to do something, but the notion of not being able to do it perfectly puts fear into you, so you don't end up doing those things. And then there's regret associated with that. And just lots of different challenges associated with not doing something through a fear of not getting things perfect. And I think we all hate making mistakes. There's nothing pleasant or comfortable about making mistakes. And that perhaps leans into that perfectionism, in that, I don't like the feeling of making mistakes. I don't think anybody likes the feeling of making mistakes. But something that I've learned through growth mindset over the past few years is that in order to learn and in order to grow as an individual, you have to make mistakes, because that's the only way that you learn. You don't learn from being praised all the time and from not making any mistakes, from being perfect at everything, because how can you learn what you need to improve on? How can you learn how to do things differently if what you do is perfect, quote unquote, every single time? You're not going to learn anything if you're trying to do things perfectly all of the time. So yeah, the very notion of perfectionism is something that is quite conflicting with having a growth mindset and with learning from your mistakes and just trying to grow as a human being. I think another question to ask is, what is perfect? I'm sure we've all got our own idea in our heads of what we think perfect might be in when we're looking at another person, or when we're looking at the work that we do, or the way that we want to live our lives. We have an idea of what we think perfect would look like, but I think it's very hard to describe what perfect actually is. I don't know what perfect looks like, either in a person or in the work that I do or the goals that I have for myself. I don't know what perfect would look like. So then that that brings up the question of, if I don't know what perfect looks like and it's something that I'm always striving for, then am I ever going to be happy with whatever I do? And the very simple answer to that is no, unless I change the way that I'm thinking. But it's also quite an interesting thing to think about in terms of the positive things that trying to be perfect can bring us. I started to think about this in a bit more detail, and you could argue that perfectionism has driven humans to the place that we are now. The space exploration that we've been on, the technology that we have available to us at this moment in time in 2025 is driven by people wanting to find solutions to problems and potentially wanting to find the perfect solution to the problems that we have. So in one sense, it's a positive thing because it drives us as human beings. And when it's used in the right way, I guess, it helps us to do things that we would consider to be impossible, perhaps. And then it makes me wonder where that trait has come from. Is it an inherited trait that we have, where it is simply part of our biology that is passed on from generation to generation, where we are looking for perfection? You could argue that the human race as it stands at the moment is one of the more perfect forms of human beings from the past. Fundamentally, if you didn't have survival skills, if we go back to Neanderthalic times, if you didn't have survival skills, if you couldn't survive, you could argue, perfectly, if you didn't have a good immune system, if you didn't know how to hunt and you didn't know how to cook food, didn't know how to start a fire, didn't know how to mate, how to survive an attack from a predator, then you weren't as perfect as people that could do those things. And the people that could do those things would go on to reproduce and ultimately produce the human race that we have today. Now, I don't think it's all to do with perfectionism. In fact, it's probably got nothing to do with perfectionism, but it was just an interesting thought that came to my mind when I was thinking about this topic and thinking about why I'm trying to be perfect all the time. And I've noticed recently that perfectionism has crept in a lot more than usual. And I think it relates to episode 12, where I talk about getting the balance right, in that when I'm trying to do everything and I don't have the balance quite right, I overthink things, and I am in that overthinking trying to be perfect. So not only am I trying to do everything, I'm trying to do everything perfectly. which is simply impossible. It's impossible to do everything, but it's also impossible to do everything perfectly. Because A, we can't do everything all at the same time, and B, there is no, or in my mind anyway, there is no definition of perfection. We don't know what perfect looks like. Okay, it's something without any flaws, but flaws to one person might be very different to flaws to another person. So that notion of trying to do everything perfectly is just simply impossible, because I'm never going to be perfect. Nobody is ever going to be perfect. So me trying to do everything perfectly is just simply impossible. And that's where that feeling of overwhelm comes in a lot more, because I'm still trying to do everything perfectly, but I also know that it's an impossible thing to try and achieve. And I know that I will never get to that standard that I set for myself, or that I think society has set for me. And it also makes me think of where this idea of wanting to be perfect has come from. And through having therapy last year, I now realise that it comes from this core belief of not being enough. If I strive for perfection and I achieve perfection, which I've just stated is impossible, then would that make me enough? And I think the way that my brain is wired at the moment, or should I say the way that my brain has been moulded over the past 27, nearly 28 years of my life, the way that my brain has been moulded in a way that makes me think if I am perfect, then I'll be enough. But as I know from when I had therapy last year, that's not the case. I am always going to be enough. So striving to be perfect isn't going to support me. It's not going to support my mental health first and foremost, but it's also not going to support me in achieving the goals that I have. And yeah, in ultimately just being content with life and living life to the fullest. If I'm trying to be perfect in everything that I do, then I'm not going to be able to live a fulfilling life, because as I mentioned earlier in the episode, perfectionism often leads to inaction, and inaction leads to regret leads to unhappiness and discontentment. One thing that I've also noticed is that this feeling of overwhelm because I'm not getting the balance right is leading to this perfectionism. It's then leading me to not be my true self. I end up putting barriers up and I end up hiding my true self from the person that I'm dating, potentially, but also from the people that are close to me. So my family and my close friends. Because I put up this wall that everything is okay and that I'm fine and nothing is wrong and they don't need to worry about me, when actually maybe things aren't okay. Maybe I am feeling overwhelmed and I haven't spoken to anybody about that. Maybe I do feel like I'm doing too much, and having somebody else's opinion on how I could prioritize things better, or getting an alternative perspective on the things that I'm doing, could be really useful in that situation. So yeah, by not talking to people, by hiding the way that I'm feeling, by hiding this version of myself that I don't feel is good enough, and by putting up these walls, it means that I am not allowing people into my life fully. And I'm doing that with the people that are closest to me at this moment in time. So it then makes me worried for my future self of whether I will allow any future partners or a future partner into my life fully. Because I don't want to have to hide who I am from a future partner. And I think that's become especially prevalent and is having a considerable amount of headspace for me at the moment, because I'm dating somebody. And because it's still quite early on. So again, this is perhaps overthinking, and maybe it's a bit of oversharing as well, but I've always said that I want to try and be relatable and be authentic. So here we are. Speaking to this person, I don't want to put barriers up. I want to be able to be my authentic self, to be my true self, and not feel like I'm having to pretend to be somebody that I'm not in order to impress somebody else. And again, I think that comes back to that perfectionism. I think that comes back to that perfectionism and not feeling like I'm enough, because by trying to impress somebody, maybe they will think that I'm enough, and therefore I will feel like I'm enough. And ultimately, like, as I've already highlighted multiple times, that just simply isn't the case. I need to be enough within myself and not put that onto somebody else in a future relationship. So, yeah, perfectionism is not supporting me at this moment in time. And I think it's come up mainly from the fact that I am dating somebody and I feel like things are going quite well, and I want things to continue going well. And I also think it's born from this unbalanced life that I'm perhaps leading at the moment, that I mentioned in the previous episode. So trying to understand where that perfectionism is coming from is something that I'm doing at the moment. And the first thing is recognizing that I'm thinking in that way. And the very fact that I'm recording a podcast episode on this shows that I have recognized it. And I know where it's coming from as well, which is also an important thing, because that allows me to change my behavior to, as I mentioned earlier, the molding of my brain is in a certain way, but it doesn't mean that I can't remold it into a new way. I can't create new pathways of thinking that enable me to manage this thought process or manage these thought processes better. I'm very much a believer that the brain can be remolded throughout your entire life, and there's research to support that as well. So I hate the saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You absolutely can. It doesn't matter how old you are, you can always learn something new. It might just take you a bit longer the older that you get. But our brain, at least from the way that I understand it and the evidence that I've seen, is more like clay. It's not concrete when we get to a certain age. It is clay, and it can be remolded throughout our entire life. But that is a tangent. We're focusing on perfectionism here. And what I'm saying is, by recording this and sharing this information, I'm clarifying my own thoughts, as I've mentioned in previous episodes. That's part of the reason why I record the episode. But it's also hopefully to help other people understand or realize that if they are trying to be perfect, that maybe it's not supporting them, but that importantly, there is an alternative as well. Just because you might be acting in a way that leads to perfection at this moment in time doesn't mean that that is always going to be the case. And it's something that I'm working on at this moment in time. It's a challenge that I'm currently facing, but it's also a question that I have for my future self, and particularly around the future relationships that I have, whether that be romantic or whether that be with friends. Am I going to let perfectionism hold me back and not allow me to present my true self to the people that I care about? Not even to the people that I care about, even to, like, particularly to the people that I care about, but also to people that I meet along the way. I don't want to be fake. I don't want to I don't want to hide who I am for other people. I want to embrace who I am. I want to accept who I am, which I think is another thing that's really important, is just accepting that I am enough, but also accepting that I am flawed. Just like we all are. I am never going to be perfect. I am always going to make mistakes. And I have made plenty of mistakes and had plenty of failures throughout my life. But then the most successful people in the world have also had failures as well. The last thing that I want to talk about is how perfectionism kind of is presented in the modern world. And this thought came from a podcast that I listened to on the journey up to Birmingham today. The podcast that I was listening to was from Mel Robbins, and I'll put a link to the episode down below. And she was basically talking about all of the mistakes that she made in her 20s and what she would do differently if she was to live that time again. And one of the things that she mentioned was that she thinks it's harder for people in their 20s at this moment in time because of the world that we live in and the access that we have, to information, but also to what everybody else is doing. That comparison is so front and center in our lives. We are constantly seeing what we could consider to be a perfect version of other people's lives. Social media is exactly that. As I've mentioned plenty of times before, we always post our highlight reels on social media. We never post, or should I say, very rarely do we see the challenges that people face, but also we don't tend to want to see that information as well, because it can be seen as quite negative. So we're looking for not perfect, but we're looking for things that are, I don't even know, to be honest. I don't know where I'm going with that, but a lot of the time we look at social media, we think that everybody has their life figured out. We think that everybody is perfect. We think that everybody else is getting married, so we should get married. We think that everybody is traveling, so we should go traveling. We think everybody has the perfect job and that our job isn't good enough. We think everybody is earning loads of money. Everybody has the latest clothes, the latest technology, the latest car, has the perfect house with the perfect partner. We just think everything that everybody else has is perfect. And a lot of the time, it's simply not the case. So reminding ourselves that what we see on social media is people's highlights is really important, to remind ourselves that nobody is perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. And Mel Robbins was saying in this podcast episode that she thinks it's very challenging for today's generations of 20-year-olds, or people in their 20s, should I say, because of how much exposure we have to what everybody else is doing. Whereas in the past, it would only be your immediate circle, because that was the information that you had access to. That was the people that you spoke to. You didn't see photos online of everybody in your school year and what they did, everybody that was in your university year, everybody that is distant friends or distant relatives, whatever it might be. You didn't have that access and that abundance of information about what everybody else was doing. So it was relieving for me to hear that, because at least somebody kind of understood what it can be like to be living in your 20s at the moment, and fundamentally to be living in the world that we live in. Not even in your 20s, just whatever age you are, it can be so difficult to, because of the amount of exposure we have to what everybody else is doing. I think potentially the older you get, the less you're looking for perfect. But I don't know, because I'm not there yet. So maybe if you are not in your 20s, you're older than I am, and you can impart some wisdom onto me. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are around whether you're still striving for perfection, or whether you've come to terms with the fact that nobody is perfect and everybody makes mistakes. I'd love to know what your opinions are on that. So please feel free to drop me a message. But yeah, I feel like I've done another bit of a ramble on perfectionism and why I think I'm trying to be perfect and how I think that's impacting my life. Like I say, it's a challenge that I have faced throughout my entire life, and it's a challenge that I'm still facing at this moment in time. And the question that I have for my future self is, am I going to let the want to be perfect hold me back from simply being happy and being in the present moment and being content with the life that I have? I think if there's anything that I can try and learn, and perhaps we can all try and learn about perfectionism, is if we're constantly striving for more, we'll never be happy with the life that we currently have. And that could mean that we live our entire lives without ever experiencing happiness, without ever being present in the current moment, and without being content either. And I don't want to live a life like that. I don't know whether you want to live a life like that either. Of course, I want more for my life, and I want to live or to have access to more things. But I also want to appreciate the things that I have right now, the opportunities that are present in front of me, and be present in everything that I do in this moment in time. So, yeah, I think that's a nice place to end things. Again, hopefully that has been a useful episode to listen to. I'd love to know what your thoughts are on perfectionism, but also on how you're interpreting all of the information that is in the podcast and has been shared on the podcast recently, or not even recently, ever since I started. Leave a comment down below, or feel free to drop me a private message as well on Instagram's probably the easiest thing. And also, if you find these episodes useful, please feel free to share them with friends, share them on your own social media if that's something that you think people would find interesting or would find perhaps solace in listening to. But yeah, even if it's just sharing it with one person in a private message that you think they might benefit from listening to some of the content that I have to share, then I would greatly appreciate that. But I hope, or I would like to hope, they would appreciate hearing this information as well, because you've passed it on to them. So yeah, I'm going to leave things there. As always, if you have been listening or watching, thank you very much. I appreciate all the support that people give me through this podcast and the messages that I receive from people. So thank you very much. And as always, my name is Tom Regan, and this is the Training Tom podcast.